Good morning. Today, my group and I will talk about the most eccentric trusts in history. But first of all, we must establish the definition of a trust. So, what is a trust? A trust is a fiduciary relationship in which one party, the truster, gives another party, the trustee, the right to hold property or assets on behalf of a beneficiary. In a fiduciary relationship, one person holds a legal or ethical obligation to prudently care for another person's assets. Accordingly, what is a trust used for? A trust can be used to determine how a person's money should be managed and distributed while that person is alive or after their death. A trust helps avoid taxes and probate. It can protect assets from creditors, and it can dictate the terms of an inheritance for beneficiaries. A trust is one way to provide for a beneficiary who is underage or has a mental disability that may impair his abilities to manage finances. Once the beneficiary has deemed capable of managing his assets, he or she will receive possession of the trust. An important characteristic of a trust is that funds not distributed from a trust are taxed. Now we shall look at it from the opposite perspective. The disadvantages of trusts are that they require time and money to create, and that they cannot be easily revoked. Now let's look at the different types of trusts. Many different types of trusts exist in various legal systems, such as credit shelter trusts, generation skipping trusts, qualified personal residence trusts, insurance trusts, qualified terminable interest property trusts, separate share trusts, and amongst many more. However, the two most essential trusts are a living trust, which is a written document in which an individual's assets are provided as a trust for the individual's use and benefit during his lifetime. These assets are transferred to his beneficiaries at the time of the individual's death. The second is a testamentary trust, which is created through the will of someone who has passed away and specify how the assets of the individual are designated after his death. These two essential trusts can be further divided into revocable or irrevocable trusts. A revocable trust can be changed or terminated by the truster during his lifetime. It is used to avoid having your estate subject to probate, which is the legal process of distributing your estate. Probate can be a lengthy, expensive, and public process, making it a suboptimal route for your heirs when administering your estate. Utilizing a revocable trust can be especially effective if you own property in multiple states. For instance, if you own a house here in Iowa and have a cabin in northern Minnesota, you may be subject to probate in both states when you pass. However, if those two properties are owned inside of a revocable trust, you'll likely be able to avoid probate entirely, thus making the process of administering your estate quicker and less costly. On the other hand, an irrevocable trust, as the name implies, is one the truster cannot change once it's established, or one that becomes irrevocable upon his death. Living trusts can be revocable or irrevocable. Testamentary trusts can only be irrevocable. An irrevocable trust is usually more desirable. The fact that it is unalterable, containing assets that have been permanently moved out of the truster's possession, is what allows state taxes to be minimized or avoided altogether. To conclude, the election of a trust is to be decided by the individual and only the individual itself. All types of trusts have advantages and disadvantages, but some may adapt more to the individual's necessities better than others. It all depends on the final purpose of creating a trust.
Now we're going to look into trusts in common law versus civil law. Despite the Hague Convention of 1985 on the recognition of trusts, all civil law jurisdictions in Europe except Italy, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg still refuse to accept the introduction of the trust into their national law, along with refusing to recognize it as a valid concept of private international law. Reasons for this vary around legal dogmatic reasons along with practical reasons, such as the fear of an increase in debt and tax evasion, for example. The existence of this principle makes it impossible for civil law systems to accept the infinite variety of voluntary trusts that one can find in the Anglo American legal system. In civil law systems, the principle of numerous clauses and the specificity principle make it necessary for all new forms of property rights to be specifically introduced and regulated by the legislator and in harmony with the original recognized rights in the Civil Code. Parties are not allowed to create new forms of property rights, as this is a basic difference between real rights and mere obligations that can be determined by the parties in the exercise of their freedom of contract. However, no such freedom is allowed in the case of defining real rights in property and property relations. It's not surprising that in all of Europe, only the Dutch, for example, have been able to introduce a limited version of the Anglo American Trust in their new Civil Code of the Netherlands. In Italy, for example, many scholars have successfully argued that the country does not need to enact trusts in Italian law since it can recognize foreign trusts under the Hague Convention and apply the law of the place of settlement. Also, Luxembourg has also adopted a similar approach, and there were even calls for a more open treatment of trusts in Switzerland. However, in France, an attempt to change the code in 1991 to include fiduciary institutions failed. It's clear that the introduction of the Anglo American Trust in civil law jurisdictions is impossible without a major overhaul of the structure of the property laws in civil countries. The Anglo American Trust is the product of the unique historical evolution of Anglo American law, but also the cultural and social ethos in the Anglo American world that historically asserted the independence of private individuals against the tight state control of social and personal affairs to an extent far greater than in civil law countries. The trust institution, as has been noted by a distinguished scholar, alters the balance of power between the state and the individual. However, this can only work if individuals are willing to accept the responsibilities of the office of the trustee, and if society as a whole is prepared to place confidence in fiduciary relationships beyond any safety that legal formalities can offer. Roman law as inspiration for the emergence of common law trusts. A fideikommissum is a legal institution where the owner of a property transfers his property to another person, subject to it being transferred from that person to yet another person at a later stage. Sounds familiar, right? Representatives of the Roman theory believe that the Roman fideikommissum has influenced the emergence of the common law trust in England. It is also assumed that the clerks in the Court of Chancery who drew the writs and studied canon law were aware of the Roman law which served as a basis for canon law, and although fideikommissum is often translated to trust, it is not a trust in the common law sense. It is not a trust in the common law due to the fact that, firstly, there is no split of ownership. Unlike a trustee, the fiduciary was the full legal owner of the property and therefore could enjoy the benefits of the asset himself before transferring it to the fideikommissary. There was no distinction between legal and equitable estate, or, in other words, no split of legal and equitable ownership, and according to Roman law, all ownership rights had to be combined in one person. Also, rights to the trust property, fideikommissum, and common law trust also differ with regard to the beneficiary's rights to the trust property. At the beginning, the fideikommissary had no legal remedy whatsoever to force the fiduciaries to carry out the testator's will. Both the testator and the fideikommissary had to rely upon the fiduciary's goodwill.
So now we know that trust can be the form of will. I'll be presenting about the top 5 most eccentric trusts in history. On the fifth place, we have Daily Red Rose as part of the will. This was created by Jack Benny, who was a legendary US comedian. He left an absolutely sweet and touching instruction in his will to deliver one long stem of red rose to his home for his wife, Mary, on a daily basis for the rest of her life. Moving on from the sweetness that we just witnessed,
On the fourth place, we have a legacy of bitterness. This was created by Wellington Burt, a billionaire. He used his will to put his enormous wealth, which was estimated at around $110 million, to be out of the reach of his family for almost a full century. And as well, all of his vast fortune would not be passed on until the 21st year after the death of his last surviving grandchild. This man died in 1919, but his fortune was only to be shared in 2010, exactly 91 years after. On the third place, we have a $12 million will to a dog. This one was created by Leona Helmsley. She's a billionaire hotelier, and she instructed in her will to spend $4 billion on caring for dog after rethinking on donating it to the poor. So her 9 years old dog, Trouble, received $12 million in the will, while her grandchildren were either cut out of the will or ordered to visit their grandfather's grave annually in order to inherit the share. The judge later on cut down on the dog's share, but then Trouble was still inherit a crazy amount of $2 million at the end. It's surprising to know, but you can actually have a new husband as part of the will. So Henry Heint, he's a German poet. This guy make a joke on his wife in the will by listing out a condition that Matilda, as known as his wife, has to remarry to get his estate so that there will be at least one man to regret my death. However, this joke would only be backfired today. If Henry made no other provision in his will, Matilda would get rid of the condition by disclaiming Henry's gift. This is also because Henry left no children, and so Matilda would inherit Henry's whole estate absolutely and unconditionally. On the first place, the most eccentric, craziest trust is a boozy weekend. So this was created by Roger Brown. He lost his life to prostate cancer in 2013. He left behind a secret bequest of £3,500 to his seven closest friends, with the provision that they use it for a boozy weekend away to a European city. We would like to formally apologize to Roger's two sons, Sam and Jack, for taking away some of their inheritance. We spent most of it on beer, the rest of it we wasted, said Roger Reed in an interview after the friends spent in a weekend in Berlin. That's it for our presentation. Thank you guys for listening.